When I think of an idea, be it happiness or creative genius or wisdom or aging or Ben Franklin, I immediately think not of what, but where. I think, where can I go to hang this idea on? And for me, place provides that role. It it grounds these ideas I have, because I am very much an idea person. I think without the travel element, I would just sort of float off into the ether, never to be heard from again.
That is New York Times bestselling author Eric Weiner, today's guest, talking about why travel is such a big part of the books that he writes. And that is certainly the case with his new book, which we are discussing today. It's called Ben and Me, In Search of a Founder's Formula for a Long and Useful Life. Ben, as in Ben Franklin, a big part of my childhood growing up outside of Philadelphia. And you'd be surprised at how many witty sayings or inventions or things that you've heard of that came from Ben Franklin. Such an amazing guy. And, you know, much like this show, I would say, this book and Eric's work is always a mix of travel, new perspectives on life. There's a dose of humor, and you also get some concrete takeaways that you can use to enhance your own life. That's exactly what's happening in today's episode, as you'll hear. Among other things, Eric's 3 keys to living, thinking, and aging well, the 3 big lessons he pulled from writing this book, what it means to live a useful life, the importance of curiosity, the benefits of being a, quote, genuine fake, and you're going to get behind the scenes of how a New York Times bestselling author researches and writes book, a bit about his process, and so much more. It's all packed into this wonderful conversation you're going to hear today. So buckle up, strap in, thanks for being here, and welcome to the Zero to Travel podcast, my friend.
You're listening to the Zero to Travel podcast, where we explore exciting travel-based work, lifestyle, and business opportunities, helping you to achieve your wildest travel dreams. And now your host, world wanderer and travel junkie, Jason Moore.
Hey, what's up? It's Jason here with ZeroToTravel.com. Welcome to the show, my friend. Thanks for hanging out, letting me bring a little travel into your ears today. This is a show to help you travel the world on your terms, to fill your life with as much travel as you desire, no matter what your situation or experience. Couldn't be more thrilled to bring you today's conversation with one of my all-time favorite authors who always mixes travel in to his books, which I love. And what's different and interesting about today is that we're dipping into the past. We're looking at a historical figure, the life of Benjamin Franklin. If you're from the United States, you're probably very familiar with Benjamin Franklin. He's on the $100 bill. He was one of the founding fathers, an inventor, a businessman, a real Renaissance man overall. If you're from outside the U.S., maybe this is the first time you are hearing his name. Regardless, his life and some of the wisdom he shared throughout his life offers some valuable lessons for helping us live in the modern day, navigate those complexities of modern day life. And look, it's easy to make these historical figures larger than life, but they were actual human beings, just like us, which means they were complex. They did things that weren't good. They did things that were good. And we get into all of that in this conversation. So I hope you enjoy it. I would encourage you to stick around on the back end. I'm going to share one of my favorite quotes from Eric. Speaking of wisdom, Eric has his own little Franklinisms, and he shared a little snippet about travel that I found really fascinating and freeing in some ways, and I'll explain what that's all about on the back end of this interview, so stick around for that, and I'll also leave you with a Ben Franklinism to go about your day. For now, please enjoy my conversation with Eric. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter, zerototravel.com/newsletter. It's free. You can keep in touch over there. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the other side. Eric Weiner, welcome back to the Zero to Travel podcast, my friend. Great to have you here.
Very happy to be back. And Jason, you are perhaps my favorite podcaster, so right back at you.
Well, thank you. Coming from you, it means a lot. One of my favorite authors, and I had the pleasure of getting your new book, Ben and Me, In Search of a Founder's Formula for a Long and Useful Life. in advance, and I got to read it in advance, and I have my dog-eared copy here, and I feel a little bit spoiled, to be honest.
Nothing wrong with that. You deserve it.
Thank you very much. We were talking a bit before we started recording, and you just got back from Bhutan, and I wanted to hear a little bit more about, because I know you do writing retreats there. I know you're a couple days fresh back. What was the experience like this time around? You've been there.
This is my fourth time to Bhutan, and I love it every time, I have to say. I'm growing very fond of the place. And, it's not easy to get to, which is probably why I'm so fond of it. You have to really work at it to get up there in the Himalayas. But it's an amazing country. It's not Shangri-La, as much as people like to think. They have problems there, but they're, with their whole approach of gross national happiness and sort of Buddhist philosophy, it's a special place. Let's put it that way. And I really enjoy leading these workshops. And I also spoke to a group of young writers at a Royal Thimphu College in the capital of Bhutan, and that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, you're there teaching, writing, mentoring. What are you learning from your students?
What I like about teaching writing is it reminds me why I write in the first place, and these sort of approaches or rules, whatever you want to call them, to the writing craft that I've internalized. And I didn't know that I had them until I started leading these workshops and teaching writing. I didn't know that I had anything to say. And it turns out I had a lot to say. So and maybe this is true with a lot of teachers. I think by teaching others, it reinvigorates my passion for writing.
Yeah. Well, writing, that's a whole subject I'd like to cover in our chat today, because you do teach it and you are a best-selling author. And I mean, a lot has happened in your life since you were last on the show. I mean, I know one of your books got turned into a Netflix series. That was a whole thing. And now you've written this new book. And I want to get into all things Ben Franklin and kind of like how you structured this book, which I find fascinating, and how it came together. And I have loads of questions. But yeah, just to kind of dip back into the past to one of your other books that we talked about, the Geography of Bliss, that we had you on about, that got turned into the Netflix series. How was that whole experience for you? I've been meaning to ask you, like doing the whole book to TV thing, and what was that like?
Well, it was a Peacock TV series. To set the record straight.
My apologies.
That's all right. That's all right. Netflix is sort of like the Xerox of streaming services, generic term. Yeah. Well, I think like many authors over the years, I was approached by producers who loved my book and wanted to turn it into a feature film, a documentary, whatever, and they were very enthusiastic, and then they would ghost me. And just before the pandemic, a young producer named Casey said he loved my book, but unlike the others who claimed love, he really, I could tell, was in it for the long haul and determined to turn it into a TV show. And he was able to get Rainn Wilson, best known as playing Dwight from The Office, but he's done a lot of other things too, get him interested in the project too. And he signed up essentially to play me in the docuseries. And it was, I have to say, an excellent experience. I was a co-executive producer on the project, which means they would consult with me essentially about where to go and who to talk to and that sort of thing. And I was really pleased when I saw the rough cuts that they had really captured the spirit of the show. And not every author is so pleased, I have to say, with when their book makes a transition from page to screen. But I was really happy with it. I've met Rainn a couple times, and he's a very decent, actually very serious person. And as I like to say, he's just like me, only more famous and with more hair. So there you go.
That's cool. It's amazing that congratulations and all that. And sounds
Thank
like,
you.
yeah, I'm sure after you put so much blood, sweat, and tears into a book, to see it translated in a way that makes you feel good.
Well, it gives it another life, basically, right?
Yeah.
So, the book came out 15 years ago, but, here it is now. It's a TV show, and it brings more readers to that book and to other books. And, it's the same but different because it's in a different medium. So it's its own creation as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I love about your books is you have these sort of overarching themes with a lot of exploration around I don't want to call it self-help, but maybe it's self-improvement. Maybe it's introspection.
Self-help adjacent. Self-help adjacent.
Yeah, self-help adjacent. But there's this travel element
Right.
because you're a traveler at heart, and that's where your roots are. And so you go to all these places and you have the experiences. So it's like you got the travelogue element. Now with this new book, it's you're kind of mixing in the history, of course. So you got the history, the travel, blend of history, travel, and you want to call maybe self-help or self-help adjacent, like you said. I mean, I don't know if that's ever, maybe it's been done before, but I thought it was quite a unique approach to a historical biography.
Yeah. I mean, well, in all my books, I try to take a hybrid approach, so that it's not just a travel book. I went here, I went to the beach, I had drinks with little umbrellas in them, or I had some adventure, whitewater rafting. So it's not just that, although it is that. It's not just history, although it is that too. And it's, not just philosophy / self-help, though it has that too. So it's tricky to pull off sometimes, but I find it gratifying trying to weave in these different threads into one book.
Yeah, and I mean, you do it incredibly well. A big part of this, the big themes, is this guide to aging and living for a long, useful life. And so there are a lot of lessons and some wisdom I know that felt like that you pulled out and that you're probably still carrying with you. We're going to get into those questions. But, we should, because this is a travel podcast, we should start with travel, because it seems like you and Ben have some things in common along the lines of travel. You said, quote, Ben and I have this in common. We were both bitten by the travel bug at a young age. And then later in the book, you said, returning to the U.S. after a decade abroad, I felt rootless, a man without a country. Ben Franklin spent a lot of time abroad, obviously. And for people who don't know the history, yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit about what you guys have in common and travel as it relates to him. And I want to hear about your travels for this book.
Well, I mean, Ben and I both need to lose a few pounds. Let's just get that right out there. He was actually very muscular and buff when he was younger. He was a big swimmer actually throughout his life, and a boxer and a weightlifter. But when he became famous, he got kind of flabby. So yeah, we have that in common. And a sense of humor. I'd like to think we have that in common as well. Of course, he was a founding father, and I'm not, and he invented bifocals and the lightning rod. And as of now, I have not invented anything. But you're right. When it comes to travel, we do have a lot in common. That's where our lives intersect. And I have to admit, when I started researching this book, I didn't realize how much of a traveler he was. He was the most widely traveled American of his time by a long shot. He logged some 42,000 miles, which was a lot of miles back then.
Yeah.
I think in today's miles, that might be like 5 million, right? And he crossed the Atlantic 8 times. It took anywhere from 3 weeks to 13 weeks, depending on the winds, to cross the Atlantic back then. And your arrival was not guaranteed, and in-flight service was even worse than today. So traveling was not easy then. He also traveled on land. He went up and down the East Coast as deputy postmaster for the colonies. He lived abroad. He lived in London for a total of about 17 years. Not many people know that. And better known is his time, I think, in France. He lived just outside of Paris for 8 or 9 years. He visited Scotland, the Netherlands, Germany, Canada, and the Portuguese island of Madeira for 3 days. It was kind of a layover. And he, like many of the founders of the time, loved Madeira wine. That was the wine that fueled the revolution. So he got around. He definitely got around, and he loved to travel, and he would get cranky if he didn't take his annual summer sojourn.
Are you the same way? If you haven't traveled for a while, do you get a little?
Yes, I do get cranky.
Yeah.
And he was also, I should say, he was a picky traveler too. I mean, he, if TripAdvisor had been around back then, look out hotels and inns where Ben Franklin stayed. I mean, he called this one hotel in Portsmouth, England, a wretched inn, and complained that even the stationery they provided was shoddy. And he didn't like the town of Gravesend in England, called it a cursed biting place. And yeah, no, he had opinions.
Yeah, wasn't afraid to express them, I guess.
Right.
You obviously weave travel into your books. Is that because you love to travel and you love to make travel a part of the writing process?
Well, I do love to travel, but I've done. It's more than that. It's more than just. I mean, one friend said, "Oh, your books are an excuse to travel the world in a tax deductible way," and that's only partly true. And if the IRS is listening, I've got the receipts. But it's also that when I think of an idea, be it happiness or creative genius or wisdom or aging or Ben Franklin, I immediately think not of what, but where. I think, where can I go to hang this idea on? And for me, place provides that role. It grounds these ideas I have, because I am very much an idea person. I think without the travel element, I would just sort of float off into the ether, never to be heard from again. So by going somewhere, and in the case of this book, seeing where Ben Franklin developed his ideas, walking the steps where he walked, and visiting the places he visited, it keeps me grounded.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what are some of the other parts of travel that make you feel connected to the world in a different way? I'm going to give you an example so I don't put you too much on the spot here, but in the book you quoted architect Mary Donati. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her last name correctly. And I love this. And she said, quote, "Old buildings are like memories that you can touch." It's so beautiful. You said that this was when you were in a small island on the English Channel, and you said you could get all the info you needed online, but it wouldn't be the same because you wanted to feel connected in that way and smell it and touch it and be in a place.
Yeah, I mean,
was.
and this is true for me. This is true for any traveler or tourist. I mean, you could, schlep all the way to Florence to see the Uffizi, or you could just go online, and I'm sure every painting, every work of art is there online. You can sit in your boxer shorts at home and watch it, on your computer monitor. But we don't do that, of course, or we do, but it's not enough. We want to go there and be in the place. And, I know that maybe in the age of Zoom and artificial intelligence and everything else, IRL, as they call it, in real life, gets short shrift. Yet we kind of vote with our dollars and our miles, because travel is up post-pandemic. I believe it's higher than it was pre-pandemic. We still need to be there physically, and I do as well for my book. So as long as I can, I'm going to keep traveling.
Speaking of being at home in your boxers, have you taken any good air baths lately?
Well, that requires an explanation now, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. I'm setting you up for that.
Yeah. So, there's a chapter called Naked Ben.
Yeah.
And Ben Franklin would wake up every morning. He developed this practice when he was living in London, representing Pennsylvania and the other colonies. And he lived in a nice little street called Craven Street near Charing Cross Station. And every morning he'd wake up and, throw the windows open and strip off his pajamas and just let it all hang out for about an hour and a half. And he'd sit and write or conduct some business, pace in front of the window. And he said he found it restorative and exhilarating. The neighbors on Craven Street maybe found it less restorative and exhilarating, but I love how he calls it an air bath, because if it's just sort of late middle-aged man, walking around naked in his flat in London, that sounds kind of gross, but air bath sounds, therapeutic.
It's good branding, right?
It is good branding. And he had a real knack for branding.
Well, yeah. I mean, that chapter, when I turned to it and I say Naked Ben, okay. And I was doing the research for this interview, it kind of made me think of the way sort of creative projects come together. And I don't know if this was at the outset, if you knew there was going to be a chapter called Naked Ben, but I think it's a good example of like, how could one come up with a book concept and next thing you know, you're writing a chapter called Naked Ben. It's just kind of, it's interesting how unexpected things happen when you're
Right. And I guess, I really wanted this to not be a conventional biography, although there's a biography, his life story is embedded in the book. But, I don't want to, diss biographers and historians because they do important work. But somewhere along the way, someone decided that if it's, a serious biography about a serious man or woman, it has to be at least 700 pages long, and it has to be, completely devoid of any humor. And I don't know why that's the case, and especially with Benjamin Franklin, who was a terrific humorist, had a great sense of humor. He wrote all kinds of satires. He told anecdotes and jokes and stories. It seems wrong to take him more seriously than he took himself. So that's why I decided early on I wasn't going to, put him up on a pedestal and treat him like this dead, gray, frozen founding father. I was going to, make him come alive on the page.
That's a great insight into kind of the mindset and the approach. Yeah, with any creative project, I feel like one mindset shift like that can really change the entire dynamic of the whole project. I mean, you said in the book, you have a line that says, quote, "We don't take humor seriously enough." And I think that says a lot about the importance of humor. I mean, you can hear, I always, like, you're one of the few authors that when I'm reading, there's like various points where you're laughing out loud and you're like, this is like travel and it's historical. Why am I laughing out loud? It's just because you're funny.
Yeah. And it's true that humor done well is as serious as anything else. You're laughing, but there's a serious point. You look at the movies, though, that win the Academy Award, very few comedies. You look at books that win the Pulitzer Prize or other distinguished prizes, not, some, but not a lot of humor. And I think that's a shame because humor is serious. It can have a very serious point. It's just a way of making these often heavy ideas go down more smoothly. And I think, obviously, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. I mean, on the other side of the coin, you write pretty openly about some of your struggles with depression. And yeah, this goes hand in hand with happiness, which is another theme that, some of the core themes of some of your other books. And even in this book, you say, quote, "The greatest invention to emerge from the 18th century is happiness." Not the lightning rod, not bifocals, not the cotton gin. Is it hard for you to open up like that?
Well, let me back up a second and, different coin, different side of the coin. It's really the same side. I think, a lot of comedians, Jim Carrey, Robin Williams was certainly, a depressive and had this dark side. And I think I'm no exception. Humor is a way of making depression bearable. It's also a way of writing about or talking about depression and other mental health issues with a lighter touch. So I think the humor enables me to open up more about it because, it just makes it lighter, I think. Otherwise, it would just be ponderous. So, no, I decided early on as a writer, I wasn't going to, pretend that I was perfect in this model of mental health. I'm not. Just ask my wife, she'll tell you. But I find it gratifying to put it down on the page because, as I like to say, pain articulated is pain diminished. When we're able to articulate where it hurts less. That's true, I think, of physical pain and certainly of emotional pain. And, I don't go on at length about my depression. Certainly there are others who suffer worse than me, but it's there, and I'm glad it's there.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. It's, well, you mentioned not pretending and that and kind of just being who you are. And that kind of led me to think about authenticity and being your authentic self, which is something you also talk about in this book, because there's a bit of commentary around masks that Ben Franklin wore, wearing different masks. And you were kind of comparing it to you, or you could say anybody really, like you have the husband mask, the dad mask. You said you had like the journalism mask you wore for many years and things like that. And arguing at one point that perhaps there's no authentic self and that we just wear different masks all the time. I'm just wondering, where do you land with that today?
Well, let me tie this to Franklin for a second, if I can. That so he wrote under dozens, if not hundreds, of pseudonyms. He wrote as a middle-aged widow from Boston. He wrote as a single mom from New Jersey, I believe. He wrote as an Algerian emir, as the king of Prussia. He wrote as his own gout, the disease. He wrote as his left foot, I believe. So, I mean, he would take on all these personas, and people back then complained that where was the real Ben behind all these masks? And it's a legitimate question then, as it is now, and we're very keen on authenticity, or at least the appearance of authenticity, if that's not ironic. Today, every company wants to be authentic, every politician wants to be authentic, but what if there is no authentic Eric or authentic Jason? We're different around different people, different times of our lives. And, the Buddhists certainly believe that there is no authentic self because there is no self. And so it's a different way of looking at this whole question of authenticity. We're sort of authentic in a different way, moment to moment, but there's no solid self that is the same, and if you look at the physiology of it, every 7 to 10 years, most, not all of our cells in our body are regenerated. They're different. So you are different on a cellular level than you were 7 years ago. And you're different emotionally and psychologically as well. I'd like to think there's a through line that holds us together, because the problem with this philosophy is it's kind of unnerving. It makes you feel uncomfortable that there's no solid self and that you're always in flux. But Franklin was very comfortable in his own skin, even as that skin changed every 7 to 10 years. And there was, I think, a core to him that made him supremely self-confident.
I guess it could be unnerving, or it could be freeing also, if you're thinking about, if you sort of disregard any ideas of masks or anything, and you're just like, well, whoever I am right in this moment, forget past, forget future, to go like a little bit Buddhist here, is just I'm being my authentic self, as long as I'm sort of being who I am in that moment, in this moment, for whatever reason, which, is that freeing, or is that unnerving to know you're not going to calibrate back to like some authentic, steady state of you? I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a totally legitimate question. And the way a philosopher / guru from the 1960s, British man named Alan Watts, put it, he said, you should be a genuine fake. And I love that because it sounds like a contradiction, but it's not really. If we're all faking it, fake it authentically, which sounds crazy, but it's not. It's being, if you're going to play the role of father, play it as authentically and in the most genuine manner that you can. If you're going to play the role of podcaster, be a genuine fake, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, it's like when I'm playing with my kids, I'm just being who I am in that moment, but obviously I'm not behaving in the same way when I'm out with like playing music with my buddies in the band I'm in, it's just you're still the same person, but it's, I don't know. These questions about identity, this stuff comes up a lot in the show because, as you travel, of course, you become untethered from all that you know.
I have a theory about that, which I do write about in the book, that we, people think, okay, we travel in order to, we feel different. You get on the road, all of a sudden you're in Paris, you feel romantic, and you're in Rio de Janeiro, you feel sexy, and, you're high in the Himalayas and you feel spiritual, and you feel like, the place has changed you. And I don't think it's the place that changes you. I think that you give yourself permission to be a different person in a different place. And, travel is essentially a parlor trick. We could be that different person back home. It's just a lot harder, There's something about just traveling with a backpack or a suitcase, and you've got all your stuff in a contained manner. You're in a hotel room or Airbnb that has none of your crap from back home, and you feel streamlined and you feel loose, and you're ready to just take an air bath and let it all hang out.
Yeah. No, yeah, I think that theory has a lot of merit. Could be part of the rush of travel in some ways. Maybe it's a hidden rush. I don't know.
It is. It's a bit of sleight of hand, but I mean, self-deception has its role, and Franklin wrote about this too, that, we're easily, we deceive ourselves, and that's not always bad. I mean, he dabbled in vegetarianism when he was a 16-year-old growing up in Boston. He discovered he was an avid reader, and he could buy more books if he saved money by not eating meat. And this worked for a while, until he found himself on a ship running away from home, sailing for New York and then Philadelphia. And the ship was floundering somewhere off the Long Island Sound and no wind. And so they started fishing and bringing this cod on board. And the cook was heating it up, and it smelled so good, and he wanted to eat it. But then he said, I can't, I'm a vegetarian. Then he notices that there are little fish inside the big fish. So he said to himself, well, if the fish can eat other fish, why can't I eat them? And he concludes, such a convenient thing it is to be a rational human. You can convince yourself of anything. And that's true.
It is so true for anybody that's made a big purchase that they weren't sure about recently. We already know that, right? You can talk yourself into it, right? I need this extra guitar in case a string breaks,
Right. And we can validate all these decisions. But I think as long as you're sort of aware, I think when Franklin said that, it was kind of tongue in cheek. He knew that, he was pulling a fast one on himself, and it was an excuse to eat the fish. But that's okay. He didn't get too hung up on that. He was like Walt Whitman in that sense. Do I contradict myself? So I do. I contain multitudes. And Franklin really contained multitudes. I mean, he wore so many different hats. He played so many different roles in a way that we don't today. I mean, can you imagine being a scientist and a statesman and a humorist and a publisher and a printer and a businessman? I mean, we're really stuck in silos today in a way that in the 18th century, many people were not.
Yeah, that's true. But then as you were rattling those things off, I was thinking, well, look at you, Eric. I mean, you're a humorist, you're a writer, you're a business person, because you have to navigate the business aspect of becoming a successful author. You're a TV producer. I mean, I feel like, in some ways we're kind of reverting back to, I'm not saying like everybody has to be a Renaissance person, but you have to.
Why not? We should all be.
Right.
I mean, and I should say, because as I was, listing what he had accomplished, he could, because he was a white male, and if he was a black slave, obviously, or a woman, he could not. So, I get into this discussion with my daughter, who's a woman, obviously 19 years old, and adopted. She's Asian American. She's adopted from Kazakhstan, and she's always chiding me. When I get all romantic about the 18th century, she reminds me it wasn't great for everyone. And that's true. That's definitely true. But if Franklin's father had never left England in the late 17th century to go to Boston, we wouldn't know the name Benjamin Franklin. I'm convinced of that. It was only in the frontier land, these wild, crazy land of the colonies, the American colonies, that Franklin, who came from a poor family, could do what he did. So it's all relative.
Yeah. Well, I mean, along those lines, and him containing multitudes, you don't shy away from the fact that he owned slaves and some of the, other sides of him, like the complexities and the faults and the, it's not like you're not trying to portray this like, freedom fighter who, was this idealism.
No, he was no saint. I mean, he had I would say, a distant relationship with his wife, Deborah. He had a very troubled relationship with his son, William, who remained a loyalist to the end, and they were essentially estranged by the end of Ben Franklin's life. And he did He had 7 enslaved people in his household at various times. That's less than Thomas Jefferson's 600, but still, the one the one I think really saving grace, if we can call it that, for Franklin, is that he changed his mind. He became an ardent abolitionist by the end of his life. We're talking well into his 70s and 80s. And that is one of the things I find most admirable about him, is that he was willing to change his mind about really big, important things like the British Empire. He was a loyal subject of the king until he wasn't. At age 69, he became a rebel. And in his 70s and 80s, he became a vocal abolitionist. Now it seems self-evident that slavery is wrong and needs to be abolished. It was not at all self-evident during Franklin's time.
What lessons can we take from that? How do you keep an open mind, or being open to change, or dramatic sort of?
Yeah,
yeah,
that's a good question. I think we become so invested in our positions and our opinions that we're unwilling to relinquish them because we feel like we're going to lose something. And Franklin wasn't like that. He realized that he had more to gain by sometimes changing his opinions than holding on to them. And I think it stemmed from his scientific background, what's sometimes been called his empirical temper, which means he really based his views on experience. Like, what did he see and hear? How did things look to him, whether it was experimenting with electricity or looking at human behavior? It was always experience first. And in this day and age, we get so little information through direct experience, or at least not information that we trust. We get a lot is mediated through the media, through social media. So in a strange way, I think we're not really sure what we experience directly, how we feel about something, because it all comes to us through newspapers, through YouTube, through TikTok, or even through friends' opinions. Franklin would look at things clearly and say, that's not the way it seems to me, or that is the way it seems to me, based on my experience. And I think we could all benefit from returning to that in a way.
Yeah. Along the lines of sort of wisdom or key takeaways from here, and you didn't get any of these questions in advance, right, by the way, so I'll put you on the spot here. But
go ahead.
There's the big themes of living, thinking, and aging well. It's part of this book, and I was wondering if you were going to pull out 3 keys to living, thinking, and aging well. It doesn't have to be the only 3, but let's say your top 3 lessons that you've learned from Ben Franklin, from writing this book, maybe something that you're perhaps even using daily, or kind of leaning on the regular, or maybe it's just, some perspectives or ideas. Can you think of, are there any that kind of jump to the top of the heap for you?
Oh boy. Okay. Well, one is going to be a slight repetition of what we were just discussing. It is that capacity for self-doubt, that willingness to change your mind, to hold your ideas and your beliefs loosely. It doesn't mean you don't have ideas and beliefs. It just means that you're not so invested in them that you can't let them go and replace them with new ideas and beliefs based on new experience. That's theme number 1. Theme number 2, I think, would be usefulness. When Franklin died in Philadelphia, the attending physician wrote in his notes, cause of death, so-and-so, and then he wrote, and so ends a long and useful life of 84 years and 3 months. He could have just said a long life or a long and noble life, but I think that his choice of words was no accident, a long and useful life. And this was what sort of guided Franklin throughout his life, is how can he be useful? How can he invent something that will improve people's lives? And he invented many things, never patented, and patents existed back then, never patented a single one because he believed in paying it forward, that we all benefit from the inventions of others. And he thought, how can he find the intersection of his abilities and the needs of others? Whether it was starting the first library in the colonies or the first hospital, or a lightning rod is the ultimate in usefulness. It saves lives. And he applied it to the world of politics and diplomacy as well. How can he help the young American nation win independence from the British? Well, by going to France and convincing the French that it was also in their interest to help the American rebels, which I think brings me to the third lesson, which is something, unfortunately, we don't have much of in the U.S. these days, at least, which is compromise, the ability to contain your anger. Franklin got angry like anybody. He was human, but he rarely expressed that anger directly. He would express it indirectly, by swimming and burning off steam, or lifting weights. He would also write these angry letters. I almost said emails, but letters, and you see them in the collected papers of Ben Franklin. I would see these letters and say, man, that doesn't sound like him. It's leaning into that guy. And then there's a little note at the bottom that says, letter not sent. So he would sit on them for 24 hours and then revisit them. And, 9 times out of 10, he would just say, I'm not going to send this, or he would tone it down considerably. So he hated conflict. I don't know if that's because he came from a big family or where that came from, but he avoided conflict in a productive way, not a passive-aggressive way. And that sense of compromise is something I think we could all benefit from.
Yeah. I mean, way to pull those 3 keys right off the top. Incredible.
And I had no preparation. Okay. I did not see that coming.
Well, I mean, I just wanted to pull out a couple things just to kind of add a bit to what you just shared on usefulness. I just love to give people some practical takeaways. And one of the things you said in the book is Ben bracketed his day with 2 questions. In the morning, he'd asked himself, what good shall I do this day? And in the evening, what good have I done today? And so those are, I mean, anybody can take those today and ask himself the same question.
I know it's so simple. It's so simple, right? And we tend to be more, just call it what it is, self-centered about even if you look at daily planners, of which I'm a big fan. I love a paper planner. Problem is I buy them by the dozens, different kinds. And anyway, it's a problem. I have a problem. But anyway, they will often have, what are your wins for the day? What are you grateful for today? What are your accomplishments? But rarely will they say, like, what good have you done for someone else today? I'm sure that exists in some planner out there, but it seems so obvious. And Franklin, speaking about planners, he was the man with a plan. I mean, he had his 13 virtues that he, went about at age 25. He was going to get his act together and came up with this plan of, tracking these 13 virtues, everything from sincerity to chastity, and seeing how well he kept to them. Well, the answer is not so well, but at least he tried.
Well, I mean, it doesn't sound much different from many of us that try to make rules for ourselves until they break them, like the cinnamon bun I ate earlier today before this interview. Like, not going to have any sweets today.
That would be, I think, rule number 2, temperance. No, rule number 1, I think, was temperance, because he thought if you weren't sober and not stuffing your face all the time, you couldn't do the other virtues. But anyway, go ahead.
Right. Well, I mean, along the lines of living a useful life, or a power question, how am I going to be useful? I mean, I'm wondering for you, is that something you contemplated before the book? Is this something you even thought about? And has that changed for you now? Like your definition of what it means to live a useful life, let's say.
Yeah. I mean, when I first learned of Ben Franklin's focus on usefulness, I looked at myself and compared myself to my parents, both of whom passed away fairly recently, that my father was a doctor, he saved lives, and my mother was a school teacher for a while, and, she enriched lives. I have friends who are meditation teachers who, work as EMTs, whatever it is. It seems that their usefulness is more clear cut. Is a writer useful? I'd like to think so.
Hell yes.
But it
is the answer to that. Hell yes.
It's all I can do. I mean, that's the thing. I used to fly airplanes, right, when I was young, small planes. And when I was a teenager, actually, I had a pilot's license. And I suppose I could have pursued a career as an airline pilot, but that would be useful getting people from point A to point B. But, I don't think it'll be making the use of my abilities as a writer. And let's face it, you don't really want your pilot to be the creative type. Like imagine, you hop on an SAS flight and the pilot comes on and says, ladies and gentlemen, it's Captain speaking. I've been stuck in a bit of a creative rut recently, so I'm going to just try something a little different today. Fasten your seatbelts and hold on tight. No, you don't you don't want that. So it's being useful in a way that's honest to who you are. So this is what I can do. I can write. I can tell stories. I can teach writing. So I think I'm more comfortable with that. I've also, I'm no Mother Teresa, but I did, starting in January, begin volunteering occasionally at what used to be called a soup kitchen, and I guess a place that feeds homeless people and people without meals down the road from my house. And I find that gratifying. And it's just a different approach to life. If you look at everything through the prism of usefulness, it changes everything. And I think as you get older, you begin to preface your sentences with phrases like, as you get older. I never used to say that before, but now I do. But as you get older, you do want to give back. And it's not a quid pro quo. It's not, if a young aspiring journalist comes to me for help, I'll help them, give them some advice. And I'm not going to get anything back, By the time they achieve stellar success, I'll probably be long gone. But it's a kind of power trip, I suppose, but in a good way. You feel that you have the power to help someone. And that's what Franklin leveraged so incredibly throughout his life. He would leverage his abilities with other people's needs.
Yeah, the usefulness lens, as you were sharing that, I mean, it does have layers. You could say, for example, let's say you get up every morning and you journal, and that's something you do for yourself because it's, it clears your head and makes you feel good. And, let's say you do that instead of, taking care of your family for those 15 minutes or whatever the case is. I'm just using that as an example. I mean, even though you could say, well, maybe that's not useful to interacting with the world, but maybe it's useful to you, which makes you calm, which makes your interactions with the world during that day much more positive, which means you're going to have a more positive effect on the people that you come into. You know what I'm saying? Like some of these things that could be perceived as selfish.
Yes, that's the old, put on your oxygen mask before helping others. As long as you eventually get around to helping others and don't take their oxygen mask and, combine that with yours. So, I mean, Franklin had very little patience for metaphysics. He was much more practical than that. But he did do things that cleared his head, like walking, going for long walks, swimming across the Thames River in London or in the Seine in Paris. And he enjoyed life too. I mean, he wasn't this sort of dour Mother Teresa figure. He enjoyed the company of women. He enjoyed Madeira wine. He enjoyed conversation. He enjoyed playing chess. He enjoyed all these things. And just to contrast him with another founder, John Adams, and they were both in Paris at the same time. I mean, Adams was a brilliant man, yes, but not a lot of fun. He gets to Paris and he sees Franklin, just holding court, in these late night sessions and salons in Paris and sleeping late. And he's like, where's the serious business is not being done. And what Adams didn't realize is that's how the serious business was being done. That's how the French conducted business. And Franklin knew that. So Franklin was very good at meeting people where they are. And he had this kind of fluid personality that could achieve that. And it made him an enigma to his colleagues like John Adams and others. But it made him incredibly effective and very endearing to the French. The French loved him, and he loved the French.
Yeah, it's easy to. That's like the modern day version of that might be like, I'm not being productive because I'm out, interacting with this, that, or the other, and I'm not sitting in front of my computer sending emails. It's like, well, there's a lot of different ways to be quote unquote productive. Right?
Exactly. And productivity and fun are not mutually exclusive.
Right. There you go. So that gives everybody listening an excuse to go quote unquote be productive today. Go have fun.
Go have a glass of Madeira.
Have fun. Yeah. On aging, because that was another big theme of this book, and you just mentioned it, as I get older, you say in the book, old age, it frightens me. Death frightens me too, but old age frightens me more. I'm wondering. And then, of course, at some point you say, I think maybe it's on the back, this is a guide to aging as well in the book. It's one of the big themes. And I'm just wondering, anything you learned during the writing of this book that changed your attitude towards aging?
Yes, I have to stop bitching about it so much because Franklin, as I mentioned, he lived to the age 84, which is pretty old now and definitely old back then. And he aged really well. I mean, that doesn't mean that he didn't have physical ailments. He did. He had kidney stones and gout and psoriasis. He was overweight. So he had physical ailments, but he did not dwell on them. He approached his body from a sense of gratitude, grateful for what it still could do. That's one thing. Another thing is that he never retired. He briefly retired at age 42 from business when he had started a successful newspaper and printing business in Philadelphia. That lasted a very short while before he got involved in electrical experiments and then politics and diplomacy. And then, as I said, he kept growing and changing his mind as he got older. He was 69 years old when he became a rebel. He was in London, loyal to the crown, infuriated by the British parliamentarians, but loyal to the king. And then he snapped and he went to the rebel side. He had more to lose and less to gain than any of the other founders. But he took that chance. And then at age 70, he first goes to Canada in when it's late winter, early spring, it's freezing cold. He nearly dies on that mission to Montreal. And then he sails for France, and then at age 81, he comes back to America and he's attending the Constitutional Convention, with other delegates, most of whom are young enough to be his grandson, let alone his son. So, don't stop, I guess. Don't stop doing things and taking chances would be another lesson I take from him. Okay.
Yeah. And that way, some of the cultural constructs or society can be brutal in terms of the view or the approach to older folks or aging, or it's basically there's a lot of youth culture worship, at least in the States.
Yes,
I would say.
Yes, and there was a bit of that back in Franklin's time. It wasn't as bad. At the Constitutional Conventions in Philadelphia, 1787, he's 81 years old, and he's actually, on some days he's being carried in this kind of litter, this sort of portable chair, being carried from his house for the block or two to what's now Independence Hall, was the Pennsylvania State House for the convention. And some people did poke fun at him behind his back, but he contributed to the convention in the ways he could, and he, played the role of the elder statesman very well. And some historians believe that he saved the day by coming up with a great compromise called, I think, the Grand Compromise, which came up with the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate. And, it's not clear there would have been a constitution without Ben Franklin.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about your writing process. And sorry, I'm going to do it, but I'm really curious because I love your books and I'm like, how does he do this? How is he actually doing this? All right. I promise to make it fun. I know.
Okay. No, it's okay.
No, you were referring to Ben learning to swim. You said, quote, any activity on earth must meet two criteria, grace and utility. Is that writing for you?
Well, I mean, that's the end result is grace and utility, but the process is anything but graceful. It's messy, and I think it's messy for most writers. This is my fifth book, and it doesn't get any easier. Exactly, it doesn't really get any easier. The German writer Thomas Mann once defined a writer this way. He said, "A writer is someone for whom writing is more difficult than it is for other people," which sounds bizarre. You're like, what? But what that means is it's easy to write poorly, to just spew a bunch of cliches and garbled language and, dead phrases. But to write well is hard, and a writer is trying to write well, or as I like to say, write honestly. So writing is hard. It doesn't get any easier. I have developed more of a system, where, I try to come up once I've done all my research, which is another story, a synonym for research can be procrastination. You're aware of that. So you have to know when to stop researching and when to start writing. And then I try to come up with a model chapter for the entire book. And it's usually not necessarily the first couple chapters. It's often smack in the middle of the book. For this book, it was the chapter titled Buddha Ben. And that's where I got the idea to call each chapter, there's Naked Ben, Baby Ben, Angry Ben, and Buddha Ben. And when I used the phrase Buddha Ben, I realized that there were many Bens, and it was pretty easy from then on to come up with these chapter headers. And, all these chapters in the arranging of the book is really designed for the writer to get a handle on his or her or their activity, their material rather. So it's sort of corralling what you have and seeing how it might be organized. And then once you have the cookie cutters, you can pour in the dough and go from there.
Okay. That's interesting. I'm going to reread that chapter then, knowing that was sort of the first one. And leading up to the writing of that first chapter, and I know this is probably complicated and multi-layered to explain, but if you could just give us like the overview on what does that process look like of research and kind of like, and there's the travel element. So you have to figure out who you're going to talk to, who's going to be worth your time. Are you recording these conversations? Like, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but I'm just really curious how you kind of get all of this information and get to a point where you're like, okay, I have it. Now I have to, like you said, put it into a chapter and find like a format in which to express it.
I mean, I basically in this book, and I think most of my books, I have like three lanes going. One lane is straightforward research, library research, reading book upon book by Benjamin Franklin, about the 18th century. I tell my writing students, don't inflict your suffering on the reader. That means if you read a really boring book and there's nothing in it worthwhile, discard it. Or there might be something boring in the academic book and you have to make it interesting. So there's that. That's one lane. Another lane is the personal lane, mining my life, be it my depression or my thoughts about whatever, call it memoir, whatever you want, to make the book personal. And the third lane is the travel part. And I tend to not do that too early because when I'm on the road, I want to know what to look for, what to keep my eyes open for. And I think it's important, and I think this is good advice for any travel writer, is don't over-research your destination. By that, I mean, read the history, fine, but don't read too many other contemporary accounts of Oslo, for instance, so that by the time you get to Oslo, you've got Bruce Chatwin or Pico Iyer's thoughts in your head. You want to have your own fresh observations of the place. And I think you should have a rough plan of what you're looking for and who you're going to talk to and where you're going to go. But you have to absolutely be willing to just totally junk that, scrap it, and start over. And I've done that a number of occasions where I go someplace thinking, okay, the story here is A, and it turns out being X. So it's a certain, balance between having a plan and being completely fluid and open at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So yeah, the research part, I mean, is that How many weeks or months was that for you for this book? Do you know?
Well, my wife would say too long.
Yeah. Okay.
Too long. Takes too long. It takes me 3 to 4 years from conception to submitting manuscript,
Wow.
roughly, to finish a book. And most of that is the research. Once I sit down to start writing and I've got the wind at my back, it actually goes fairly quickly, 6 to 9 months, roughly. I really start churning it out once I'm in the groove. It's getting in the groove that's tricky.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Franklin is known for his Franklinisms. They're called, like his sort of witty sayings, like the, fish and company both stink after 3 days. I'm paraphrasing. You have your own Franklinisms. Like you say, for Franklin, failure was a down payment on success. Lines like these is why I love your books, because they're insightful and economical in a way, right? It's just
that's a good word. Yeah. So maybe I should come up with my own Poor Richard's Almanac. That's where a lot of his Franklinisms appeared. Okay, you've given me an idea for my next book.
I'm here to serve. Yeah. What is your favorite Franklinism?
Oh boy.
So many.
Well, my favorite oh boy. The favorite travel one, since this is a travel podcast, is that travel lengthens life, he said. And he once said that, 2 weeks in Paris is equivalent to 6 weeks anywhere else. And I do think that's true. And I add a little caveat to that, my own take on it, which is travel can also deepen life, not just lengthen it. But I like that about travel. You've got me stumped. I think I may know too much. But he said so much. He did believe that happiness consisted, and this might be it, that happiness consisted not of the big things in life, but the accumulation of small pleasures. Like he insisted on shaving himself well into his 80s, and there was barbers everywhere back then. And that's when he told someone he was watching this, he said, basically, it's these small pleasures in life that equal a great happiness. And that may be one of my favorite observations of his, because we're always, especially in the U.S., aiming for the big, big, big. And Franklin appreciated the small in a way that I think we no longer do.
Maybe it's mindfulness, the practice of mindfulness there, right?
Yeah, I sort of, in the Buddha Ben chapter, I argue that he was mindful. He was a Buddhist. He was what the Buddhists call a bodhisattva, a sort of enlightened being who defers going to nirvana and sticks around on this, wretched earth to help other poor sods. Useful, in other words. And that was very much Franklin. And, he could just like watch a dust devil, and chase it on horseback for hours. He could play chess into the night. I mean, he was able to lose himself in the moment, because he didn't overthink things. He was very thoughtful, but didn't overthink things the way many of us, including myself, do.
And he didn't have smartphones, so that helps.
He didn't. I mean, he loved technology. And at one point he said he bemoaned the fact that he wishes he was born 100 years later than he was, so he could have seen all the wondrous inventions and scientific developments. And as I write in the book, I kind of wish I was born 100 years earlier, as being a traveler in the 1920s as opposed to the 2020s. That's where we are. And to think for a second. And just when the world was still, there were places to be explored, and not just on Google Map. So maybe, I don't know. When would you want to be born, if you were in the time you were, or earlier, later?
I mean, I like that sentiment. If I could carry the sort of the modern day health system with me,
Right.
So they're not whatever, pulling a tooth from.
No, you don't get to choose,
No, right. Yeah. Like next thing you know, you're like, that sounds idyllic. And next thing you know, you got leeches all over your body and bloodletting is going on. And you're like, what did I wish
I think
for?
there was a narrow window maybe between the 20s and the 50s or 60s when the world was still wide open, but your chances of dying while traveling were relatively low. There was a window there. But no, getting back to your point, no smartphones and no screens of any kind. And so there was, Franklin's big business was publishing and printing and writing. And back then, the written word and the spoken word were the only two ways to communicate. If you wanted to learn about something, you can either read about it or hear about it. And that was it. There was no YouTube, no Wikipedia, no television, no radio. It was the printing press. I mean, the printing press was this almost spiritual thing that was magic, that you just, took these ideas that people were speaking and made them permanent and shareable.
Mm-hmm.
So
what do you think AI is going to do to creativity or writing or?
I mean, I'm pretty optimistic that there'll always be a place for writers, because everyone refers to AI as AI, not AEI, which would be artificial emotional intelligence. And I don't think there ever will be artificial emotional intelligence. And when you read a good writer, as much as, imbibing information, it's that emotional intelligence that you're looking for. And I'll just to tie this back to Franklin. I mean, I said he loved technology, and he did, and he loved scientific advances, but I don't know how much he would be crazy about what's going on in Silicon Valley. Apps for, delivering pizzas 10 seconds more quickly or whatever it is. I mean, his measure, his gold standard was usefulness, not just novelty. So I think he'd be wary of some of the technology and some of the solutions to problems that don't exist that are coming out of Silicon Valley. So he was not a blind techno-optimist. I mean, he saw the downsides of technology as well.
I was super inspired by the book. I encourage everybody. Well, get any of Eric's books. Seriously, I've read them all. They're incredible, all amazing.
There you go. Seriously, just get it out there. There you go.
I mean, this is the newest one. If you want the newest one, if you're inspired by this conversation, Ben and Me in Search of a Founder's Formula for a Long and Useful Life.
If you're old or plan on getting old at some point during your life, you may want to pick up the book. But if you are just going to stay 21 all your life, don't read it.
There you go. I mean, I am really inspired by the fact that he's maintained, like Ben Franklin maintained such a high level of curiosity throughout his life. I think that's one of the keys.
As you have, right? I mean,
I try.
You're doing this podcast, you're doing all kinds of things, and curiosity is huge. It's huge.
I feel like that's the thing that keeps everything exciting, right? No matter if it's a one-on-one conversation or a topic you're exploring, whatever. But there is a lot to learn from this book. I guarantee you've not read any historical biography like this, where you're laughing out loud. And I mean, I've slogged through some of them, and this is nothing like that. So just everybody, I highly encourage you to get the book, or like I said, any of Eric's books. Eric, if you will grace me with your presence on this show another time, I would be honored. Thank you.
I would be happy to do that. It would. If you would find it useful, I would be happy to do it. So,
thanks.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I love the podcast. You've really, you've grown so comfortable in it. I've been on your show a few times now, and you just sound more comfortable and more relaxed each time. Best of luck with it.
Well, thank you so much. We'll link up to your website as well, where you can get all the links to your stuff, and really appreciate your time and look forward to staying in touch.
Okay. This was a real pleasure. It increased my happiness exponentially.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
There you have it. One last thank you to Eric Weiner for stopping by today's show. How lucky are we here in the Zero to Travel community to get to talk to these amazing authors like Eric. If you have any guests you want me to bring on, some of your favorite authors, thinkers, speakers, travelers, whatever, drop me a line. Jason@zerototravel.com is my email. It's supposed to be a two-way conversation, my friend. You can get in touch. I'm here for you. I make this show for you. So please let me know who you would like to have on. Okay, I am going to share a clip from the interview, something Eric said that caught my ear that I wanted to share a few thoughts on. Have a listen.
You get on the road, all of a sudden you're in Paris, you feel romantic, and you're in Rio de Janeiro, you feel sexy, and you're high in the Himalayas and you feel spiritual, and you feel like the place has changed you. And I don't think it's the place that changes you. I think that you give yourself permission to be a different person in a different place. And travel is essentially a parlor trick. We could be that different person back home. It's just a lot harder.
I thought that was an interesting take on travel, and what I took away from that and what I want to leave you with is this challenge, this idea. We talked about authenticity and wearing masks and some of the other big themes in this interview, but that idea that you can give yourself permission to be a different person, and that perhaps comes easier when you're traveling and you're in a different location. But even though, as he said at the end, it's harder to do at home, it can be done at home. And not everybody is able to travel all the time, as we know. Some people don't want to travel all the time. But if you resonate with that freeing aspect of travel that Eric was talking about, that idea where you feel maybe more sexy in Rio, or you feel like a writer in Paris, or whatever the case is, you open up your creative soul in certain places, whatever it is, can we, as individuals, give ourselves permission at home to be those things we want to be right now in our lives? Can we find a way to do that without having to travel somewhere to give ourselves that permission? I don't know how that hits you. I don't know what that means to you right now. I don't even know what it means to me right now, but I thought it was a good thought experiment as we come out of this episode to just consider, hey, if I was going to travel somewhere right now, where would I go? In regards to what Eric was talking about, what feeling would I be searching for? And is it possible to just have that feeling at home if I just free myself, free my mind, give myself permission to just be that? I don't know. I really don't know. I don't have the answers, but that was something that I wanted to share coming out of this because it really struck me, and I wanted to share that with you before I let you go. If you have any thoughts on that, feel free to reach out. Okay, I'm going to leave you with one of these Ben Franklinisms. As Eric mentioned in the interview, a lot of these came from Poor Richard's Almanac, the book that he wrote under that pseudonym that was published from 1732 to 1758. And one of the quotes from that goes like this: "Well done is better than well said." Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Peace and love to you and yours. Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by zerototravel.com. Ideas and advice to make your travel dreams a reality.